Chapter 1. The Evolutionary Paradigm and the Roots of Sex. When Charles Darwin published his monumental treatise on the origin of species, he was remarkably silent on the subject of humanity. He understood perfectly well that his theory threatened the comforting, traditional narratives of divine creation and human exceptionalism. There was little to be gained by loudly proclaiming that human beings were merely another branch on the tree of life. Instead, near the very end of his work, he offered a quiet, almost understated prophecy. In the distant future, the study of psychology would be built upon an entirely new foundation, and fresh light would be cast on the origins of humankind. For a long time, that distant future remained elusive. Even a century after Darwin's groundbreaking publication, the biological basis of human behavior was a largely barren field of inquiry. But in the latter half of the 20th century, a quiet revolution began to reshape the biological and social sciences. A handful of pioneering biologists began to decode the hidden mathematics of social behavior, extending the logic of natural selection into the realms of altruism, courtship, and kinship. Initially, this fresh synthesis focused on the habits of ants and birds, but eventually it inevitably turned its lens upon us. This emerging framework, now recognized as evolutionary psychology, is not just a collection of scientific facts, it is a profound worldview. It possesses the power to fundamentally alter our perception of everyday social reality, shedding light on the deepest mysteries of romance, family dynamics, office politics, and moral impulses. For decades, the prevailing orthodoxy in the social sciences treated the human mind as a blank slate, an empty vessel waiting to be filled by culture. Pioneers of modern sociology and behaviorism argued that our essential nature was merely to be shaped by our environment, insisting that even the most profound emotions, like a mother's love or the sting of romantic jealousy, were not inherent to our biology. Those who challenged this established view faced intense resistance, partly because evolutionary theory had a troubled history of being twisted to justify social inequality, racism, and harsh capitalist ideologies. Yet, the modern evolutionary psychologists are not interested in creating social divisions. Instead, they look past the superficial differences among global cultures to find the profound, invisible unities that bind our species together. Beneath the vast tapestry of human customs, they observe identical underlying structures, an enduring obsession with social status, the universal experience of guilt, and an innate sense of justice that demands an eye for an eye. This deep human nature operates on multiple levels. There are the pervasive, universally recognized emotions, and then there are the complex, invisible developmental mechanisms that calibrate those emotions to fit an individual's specific environment. Our evolutionary programming absorbs cues from our surroundings as we grow, adjusting our levels of confidence, ambition, or insecurity to maximize our survival and reproductive success. Natural selection, working blindly over millions of years, has designed our conscious minds to remain blissfully oblivious to these underlying genetic motivations. Recognizing this unconscious programming can be profoundly relevant to our daily lives, serving almost as a philosophical guide to the human predicament. This is not to say that nature itself is a moral authority. Deriving our values from the ruthlessness of natural selection is a classic philosophical misstep known as the naturalistic fallacy. Still, by understanding the true, often self-serving origins of our moral sentiments, we can better evaluate which of our impulses are genuinely noble and which are merely genetic stratagems. This insight casts a new light on age-old philosophical debates regarding human goodness. While we possess a magnificent capacity for empathy and love, these traits evolved not for the greater good of humanity, but because they once aided the replication of our ancestors' genes. Our moral equipment is frequently deployed with brutal flexibility, switched on and off to serve our own interests, while our conscious minds remain completely unaware of the hypocrisy. In this sense, the traditional austere conservative view that human nature requires strict discipline and restraint holds a certain psychological validity, recognizing the inherent selfishness that resides within us all. To illustrate these powerful evolutionary principles, we can look to the life of Charles Darwin himself. Darwin provides a perfect, albeit ironic, test case. By all historical accounts, he was an exceptionally decent, humane, and gentle man, seemingly devoid of the ruthless ambition we might associate with the survival of the fittest. Yet, the refined theory of natural selection demonstrates that even a man of Darwin's extraordinary civility was fundamentally an animal, his thoughts and actions subtly guided by the imperatives of his biological heritage. Darwin came of age in an era defined by immense moral gravity. The Victorian period was characterized by an all-encompassing vigilance against indulgence and a relentless focus on duty and self-control. As a young man, Darwin initially drifted through medical studies, finding the brutal realities of unanesthetized surgery abhorrent. His pragmatic father steered him toward the clergy, a respectable profession that would allow him plenty of time to indulge his passion for the natural world. But Darwin's trajectory was permanently altered by his 5-year voyage aboard the Beagle. It was during this journey, and in the years immediately following, that he grasped the elegantly simple mechanism of natural selection. The theory posits that random variations naturally occur within any population, and those variations that best adapt an organism to its environment will be preserved and passed on to future generations. Over immense spans of time, this blind, trial-and-error process crafts the breathtaking complexity of living creatures. For human beings, the primary environment driving our recent evolution was not just the physical climate, but our social landscape. We evolved by competing with, exploiting, and cooperating with our fellow humans. Our brains expanded and developed intricate social emotions entirely as adaptations to the challenges of living alongside one another. Among the most powerful forces shaping human evolution is sexual selection, a concept Darwin himself championed, though he missed a crucial piece of the puzzle. Darwin correctly observed that across the animal kingdom, males are typically the eager wooers, while females are cautious and coy. He recognized that this dynamic leads to fierce competition among males for sexual access, driving the evolution of everything from stag antlers to peacock feathers. However, Darwin never fully understood why females were inherently the choosier sex. The answer, which eluded scientists for decades, lies in the fundamental economics of reproduction. If we imagine natural selection as an administrator trying to maximize a species' genetic legacy, we immediately see that male and female goals must diverge. A male can theoretically father hundreds of offspring in a single year, limited only by his access to fertile mates. His reproductive strategy, shaped by the minimal biological cost of producing sperm, inherently leans towards seeking maximum quantity. For a female, however, the biological investment in a single child is monumental. She produces a limited number of large, nutrient-rich eggs and must endure the heavy burdens of gestation and nursing. Because her reproductive ceiling is so low, each child represents a crucial genetic asset. Therefore, her evolutionary strategy must focus on quality. She is designed to meticulously, if unconsciously, scrutinize potential mates, seeking signs of genetic fitness and, crucially in species like ours, the willingness to invest resources and protection in her offspring. This disparity in parental investment dictates the unconscious sexual psychology of men and women. In our ancestral environment, a man who mated indiscriminately increased his chances of leaving a vast genetic legacy. But a woman who mated carelessly risked squandering her immense biological investment on offspring that lacked the necessary paternal support to survive. We see the echoes of this ancient logic perfectly preserved in modern behavior and cultural norms. Worldwide anthropological studies consistently show that men are generally more eager for casual sexual encounters, while women are distinctly more selective. This universal pattern transcends cultural boundaries, evident even in the most remote pre-industrial societies. When we observe our closest primate relatives, we see variations on this same theme. From the solitary, wandering male orangutans to the violently competitive male chimpanzees, the male drive for abundant sexual access is a constant. The females of these species, though certainly possessing strong sexual appetites, do not typically risk life and limb in a relentless quest for multiple partners. Instead, they exercise subtle choices, often favoring the strongest or most dominant males who have proven their genetic mettle. It is vital to understand that the human mind, despite its vast capacity for rational thought, is still deeply influenced by these ancient reproductive mandates. We may consciously believe we are pursuing love, beauty, or intellectual compatibility, but our desires are often the subtle promptings of evolutionary logic. natural selection has crafted our deepest passions and our most spontaneous emotional reactions to serve the ultimate goal of genetic proliferation. In the realm of courtship, our sophisticated human brains did not evolve to transcend our animal instincts. They evolved to execute those instincts with greater flexibility and cunning. Chapter 2. To fully grasp the intricate dance of human courtship, we must recognize a profound biological anomaly that separates us from the vast majority of mammals: high male parental investment. In the sprawling catalogue of mammalian life, it is exceedingly rare for a father to stick around after conception to help protect, feed, and raise his offspring. Humans, however, belong to a small, exclusive club of species where paternal devotion is a cornerstone of survival. Because human infants are born utterly helpless and require years of immense caloric and emotional resources to reach maturity, a mother ancestral to our species could vastly increase her child's chances of survival if she had a dedicated partner. This single evolutionary reality completely rewrites the rules of the mating game. Because human males invest so heavily in their offspring, they too have become selective. They are not merely spreading cheap genetic material, they are committing a massive portion of their life's energy to raising a child. Thus, both sexes in the human equation approach the mating market with intense, albeit distinct, evolutionary shopping lists. What, then, do women want? If we peel back the layers of cultural conditioning and romantic poetry, the evolutionary logic is starkly pragmatic. Because a woman is looking for a partner to help raise highly dependent children, she is unconsciously drawn to markers of a man's ability and willingness to provide. Across virtually all cultures, studies consistently reveal that women place a higher premium on a mate's financial prospects, social status, and ambition than men do. This is not a matter of superficial greed. It is a deep-seated survival mechanism. In our ancestral environment, a male's status and hunting prowess directly translated into meat for her children and protection from rival tribes. A woman's brain is naturally wired to feel genuine romantic attraction toward cues of competence and social dominance because for millions of years those traits kept her genetic lineage alive. But what else do women want? Resources are useless if a man is not willing to share them. Therefore, female psychology is highly attuned to signs of commitment, kindness, and fidelity. A wealthy or powerful man who frequently abandons his partners is a terrible evolutionary gamble. Thus, women are expertly designed to stretch out the courtship process, testing a man's patience, reading his emotional sincerity, and extracting promises of long-term devotion before granting sexual access. This cautious pacing allows a woman to filter out the opportunistic mates from the true investing fathers. Men, on the other hand, approach the market with a different set of unconscious priorities. Because male reproductive success is inherently limited by the reproductive capacity of their partners, male psychology places an overwhelming emphasis on female fertility. Since fertility cannot be directly observed, natural selection has programmed the male brain to be deeply aroused by the physical cues of youth and health: clear skin, bright eyes, high energy, and a specific waist-to-hip ratio. These physical standards of beauty, often dismissed as arbitrary cultural constructs, are in fact universal biological indicators of a woman's reproductive prime. Furthermore, because human fathers invest so heavily in their children, they face an evolutionary nightmare that women never have to worry about: cuckoldry. A mother always knows a child is biologically hers, but a father historically could never be entirely sure. If a man spends his life providing for a child fathered by a rival, he has suffered the ultimate genetic dead end. To guard against this catastrophic loss, male psychology has evolved a deep, often volatile obsession with female fidelity. This anxiety gives rise to a universal psychological phenomenon known as the Madonna-whore dichotomy. In the male subconscious, women are frequently categorized into two distinct groups: those who are chaste, faithful, and suitable for long-term investment, the Madonnas, and those who are perceived as promiscuous and suitable only for short-term sexual gratification, the whores. This dichotomy is a crude but historically effective emotional heuristic. Men are biologically driven to seek out sexual variety wherever they can find it without cost, yet they demand absolute, unblemished fidelity from the women they choose to marry and support. This brings us to the complex counter-strategies of women who must navigate this treacherous landscape. Evolutionary psychology tells us there is no single female nature when it comes to promiscuity. Instead, There are fast and slow reproductive strategies, often calibrated by the environment a young woman grows up in. If a woman is raised in an unstable environment where men are unreliable and long-term commitment seems impossible, her biological programming may trigger a fast strategy, seeking immediate resources and earlier reproduction without holding out for a lifelong provider. Conversely, in stable environments where male investment is the norm, women are more likely to adopt a slow strategy, guarding their sexual access fiercely to secure a high-quality permanent mate. Anthropologists once dreamed of peaceful, sexually liberated utopias, like Margaret Mead's famous yet fundamentally flawed depiction of Samoan islanders, where jealousy did not exist and free love reigned. But deeper investigation always reveals the same truth. Wherever there are humans, there is the intense biologically driven negotiation of sex, jealousy, and parental investment. When these competing male and female desires collide on a societal scale, they create a vast, brutal marriage market. Like any economic market, there are winners and losers. If we were to strip away our modern moral codes and look strictly at our biological inclinations, humans are naturally predisposed toward a system of mild polygyny, where highly successful men accumulate multiple wives. In a purely Darwinian state of nature, a woman is often genetically better off becoming the second or third wife of a wealthy, high-status chieftain than the only wife of a starving, low-status peasant. What then is wrong with polygyny? If it is a natural human inclination, why has modern society vehemently rejected it? The answer lies in the devastating social math of the marriage market. If the top 10% of men accumulate the top 50% of women, it leaves a massive underclass of low-status, impoverished men with absolutely no prospects for marriage or reproduction. Evolution has designed men who are deprived of mates to become fiercely competitive, risk-taking, and highly prone to violence. A society structured around polygyny is a society plagued by roaming bands of aggressive, disenfranchised men with nothing to lose. Therefore, institutionalized monogamy, the strict legal and moral enforcement of one man, one woman, is not merely an arbitrary religious doctrine. It is one of the most profound egalitarian public policies ever devised. By artificially restricting the hoarding of mates by powerful men, monogamy democratizes reproduction. It ensures that the vast majority of men have a chance to secure a wife and build a family, which in turn pacifies the male population and forms the bedrock of a stable, cohesive society. Understanding this invisible market helps us comprehend where our moral ideals come from. Our societal rules surrounding courtship, marriage, and fidelity are not handed down from the clouds. They are pragmatic cultural adaptations designed to manage the explosive biological impulses that reside within us. We pursue moral ideals not because we are angels, but because our ancestors learned that without strict codes governing our sexual behavior, the underlying Darwinian competition would tear our communities apart. Chapter 3: Darwin's Marriage and the Darwin Plan for Marital Bliss. In the summer of 1838, Charles Darwin, an immensely methodical man, sat down with a scrap of paper to calculate the trajectory of his personal life. He drew a line down the center of the page. On one side, he wrote the heading, Marry, and on the other, Not Marry. Under the negative column, he listed the loss of his freedom, the terrifying prospect of having less money for books, and the terrible forfeiture of his time to pursue science. He noted the obligation to visit relatives and the general disruptions of domestic life. But under the positive column, the evolutionary imperatives of the human male began to softly assert themselves. He wrote of the prospect of children, the companionship of a wife in his old age, and the charm of a gentle domestic partner. In a moment of pragmatic vulnerability, he noted that a wife would provide an object to be beloved and played with. Better, he concluded, than a dog, anyhow. Beneath this somewhat comical, hyper-rational accounting lay a profound biological undertow. Darwin was wrestling with the classic male dilemma, the tension between the unrestrained freedom of a solitary life and the deep, genetically ingrained drive to form a permanent pair bond and invest heavily in offspring. His conscious mind was weighing the cost to his scientific career, but his unconscious mind was being steered by millions of years of hominid evolution, pushing him toward the domestic hearth. Ultimately, the marry column won out. He concluded his notes with a definitive, enthusiastic command to himself to marry, and marry soon. Having decided on the institution, Darwin needed a partner. He did not cast a wide net into the perilous waters of the London marriage market. Instead, he retreated to the safety of familiarity, turning his attention to his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. From a purely strategic standpoint, Emma was an ideal choice. She was bright, deeply empathetic, and possessed a stabilizing, serene temperament that perfectly counterbalanced Darwin's frequent bouts of anxiety and ill health. Furthermore, aligning the Darwin and Wedgwood families cemented an already formidable network of wealth and social standing. When Darwin finally proposed and Emma accepted, he was engulfed by a wave of euphoria that surprised him in its intensity. His letters from this period are remarkably un-Victorian in their raw, passionate exuberance. He wrote to Emma of his deep, burning affection, expressing a desperate yearning for the day they would be united. This intense romantic intoxication, while deeply felt and culturally celebrated, is fundamentally a biochemical adaptation. The overwhelming rush of early romantic love is natural selection's mechanism for rapidly cementing a pair bond. It is the evolutionary glue designed to hold a man and a woman together long enough to navigate the vulnerable period of human gestation and early infant care. Nature floods the brain with neurochemicals that foster profound attachment and blind us to our partner's flaws, ensuring that the critical early stages of joint parental investment are successfully launched. However, evolutionary biology also dictates that the fiery intensity of the honeymoon phase cannot last indefinitely. Maintaining such a high state of neurochemical arousal is biologically exhausting and, over time, unnecessary once the primary bond is secured. As the initial euphoria inevitably cooled, Charles and Emma Darwin transitioned into a different yet equally vital phase of mammalian partnership. They established what could be called a masterclass in marital bliss. Their relationship morphed from passionate courtship into a profound, enduring alliance built on mutual respect, deeply intertwined routines, and the shared, all-consuming project of raising their extensive brood of children. The Darwin plan for domestic tranquility was remarkably effective, but it was set against the backdrop of a species inherently prone to marital fracture. From an evolutionary perspective, lifelong monogamy is a fragile construct constantly besieged by the divergent biological interests of men and women. As a marriage progresses and a woman moves past her peak reproductive years, the unconscious male calculus can subtly shift. The ancient ingrained temptation to seek novel, fertile partners begins to test the boundaries of commitment. Conversely, if a man fails to provide resources, protection, or status, a woman's evolutionary programming may urge her to seek a more capable partner to secure her children's future. To combat these innate centrifugal forces, society must employ powerful cultural adhesives, and the Victorian era possessed some of the strongest in human history. The moral code of Darwin's time was relentlessly strict, heavily promoting duty, piety, and absolute fidelity. But beneath the veneer of this high-minded morality lay a deeply pragmatic, almost ruthless enforcement of evolutionary imperatives. We can see this clearly in the era's glaring double standards. Victorian society brutally punished female infidelity while often turning a blind eye to the transgressions of men. This hypocrisy, while morally offensive to the modern mind, perfectly maps onto the evolutionary logic of male parental investment. Because a man risks squandering his life's labor on another man's child if his wife strays, society constructed massive, unforgiving moral walls around female chastity. A woman whose reputation was even slightly tarnished faced total social exile. Meanwhile, male promiscuity, though officially frowned upon, did not carry the same catastrophic threat to the social order of paternal certainty, and was thus handled with discreet winks and closed doors. This is the essence of how moral codes are formed. They do not descend upon us from the heavens. They emerge organically as human populations attempt to manage the volatile, often destructive biological impulses that threaten social cohesion. The Victorians were master architects of this kind of moral scaffolding. They sugar-coated the stark, brutal realities of evolutionary competition with lofty rhetoric about virtue, purity, and divine duty. By wrapping our base animal instincts in the sacred robes of religious and moral imperative, society ensures its own survival, Charles Darwin, the man who would pull back the curtain on this entire biological theatre, lived a life thoroughly orchestrated by the very forces he was destined to expose. He was a dutiful husband, an obsessively loving father, and a pillar of his community, adhering strictly to the moral codes of his day. Yet his brilliant mind was slowly assembling the puzzle pieces that would prove that his profound love for Emma, his devastating grief over the eventual loss of some of his children, and his adherence to social duty were all, at their core, magnificent adaptations crafted by the blind, unyielding hand of natural selection. Chapter 4. Families and Darwin and the Savages. If natural selection is a harsh and unforgiving accountant, tallying up survival and reproduction with cold precision, then the very existence of self-sacrifice presents a profound mystery. In a world driven by the ruthless replication of genetic material, why should any creature jeopardize its own survival for the sake of another? To look at the natural world is to see violence, competition, and selfishness. Yet when we look within the boundaries of the family, we find an astonishing counter-narrative. We see mothers starving themselves to feed their young, and siblings risking their lives to protect one another. For a long time, the mechanics behind these genes for brotherly love remained one of the most perplexing riddles in evolutionary biology. It seemed to defy the fundamental logic of Darwin's own theory. The solution to this paradox arrived more than a century after Darwin, in the form of an elegant mathematical revelation that permanently altered our understanding of biology. The breakthrough required a radical shift in perspective. We had to stop looking at the individual organism as the ultimate protagonist of evolution and start looking through the lens of the gene. Once we adopt this gene's eye view, the concept of survival takes on a radically new geometry. A gene's primary objective is to make copies of itself and propel those copies into the next generation. While the most direct route is through an individual's own reproduction, it is not the only route. Because siblings share, on average, exactly half of their genetic material, a gene residing in one individual can ensure its own survival by compelling that individual to help a sibling. This is the new math of evolutionary psychology, formerly known as inclusive fitness. It operates on a deceptively simple calculus. A gene that promotes altruism can successfully spread through a population if the cost to the organism performing the selfless act is outweighed by the benefit to the recipient, adjusted by the degree of their genetic relatedness. In practical terms, an evolutionary biologist would joke that they would gladly lay down their life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. The mathematics of bloodlines dictate our deepest affections and our most profound loyalties. The closer the genetic tie, the stronger the unconscious impulse to nurture and protect. Yet this exact same mathematics guarantees that the family home will never be a perfect haven of uninterrupted harmony. While inclusive fitness explains the existence of brotherly love, it also provides the brutal blueprint for sibling rivalry. Consider the perspective of a mother. She shares 50% of her genes with each of her children, and therefore, her evolutionary interest is to distribute her resources somewhat equally among them, maximizing the survival of her entire brood. But consider the perspective of the child. A child shares 50% of its genes with a sibling, but it shares 100% of its genes with itself. In the unconscious calculus of survival, every child values its own life twice as much as it values the life of its brother or sister. This fundamental asymmetry is why the nursery is so often a battleground. Children are biologically programmed to fiercely extract maximum investment from their parents, demanding more milk, more attention, and more protection, even if it comes at the direct expense of a sibling. The tantrums, the jealousy, and the unending competition for parental affection are not psychological aberrations. They are the ancient, predictable friction of competing genetic interests. Nowhere is the power of inclusive fitness more visible or more emotionally devastating than in the bond between parent and child. Natural selection has engineered parental love to be an overwhelmingly powerful force, a biochemical leash that binds adults to their offspring through years of exhausting dependency. And because the ultimate goal is the successful maturation of a vehicle carrying the parent's genes, the emotional weight of a child's life fluctuates according to their reproductive potential. From a purely Darwinian standpoint, the loss of an infant, while tragic, represents a relatively small loss of time and biological investment. But as a child grows, surviving the perilous early years and approaching the threshold of reproductive age, the parent's biological investment compounds massively. Charles Darwin understood this profound truth not merely as a theorist, but through the shattering reality of his own grief. Of his many children, his eldest daughter, Annie, held a singular place in his heart. She was a bright, joyous, and deeply affectionate child, the absolute center of Darwin's domestic universe. When she fell mysteriously ill at the age of 10, Darwin was plunged into a desperate, frantic state of anxiety. He traveled with her to spa towns, sought out every available medical treatment, and kept an agonizing hour-by-hour diary of her declining health. Despite his relentless efforts, Annie's fragile body succumbed to what was likely tuberculosis. When Annie died, Darwin's emotional world collapsed. The grief he experienced was raw, unyielding, and completely devastating. It permanently darkened his view of the world and was the final blow that severed whatever lingering faith he had in a benevolent God. Evolutionary psychology does not cheapen this profound sorrow by explaining its origins. Rather, it underscores the staggering biological magnitude of the loss. Darwin's agony was the exact emotional equivalent of his immense genetic and psychological investment. Grief of this magnitude is the necessary, agonizing echo of a love designed by nature to be absolute and unbreakable. The despair a parent feels is natural selection's way of ensuring that, up until the very last moment, every conceivable effort is made to keep the genetic legacy alive. But the human story does not end at the boundary of the immediate family. For millions of years, our ancestors lived in small, tightly knit hunter-gatherer bands. These tribes were essentially extended webs of kinship, composed of cousins, aunts, uncles, and half-siblings. How does the selfish math of the gene translate into the complex moral codes that govern a wider society? When Darwin embarked on his monumental 5-year voyage aboard the HMS Beagle, he encountered people living in ways that profoundly shocked his Victorian sensibilities. When the ship reached Tierra del Fuego, at the southernmost tip of South America, Darwin came face to face with indigenous tribes surviving in one of the harshest climates on Earth. In the parlance of his era, he referred to them as savages, utterly bewildered by their lack of complex technology, their raw existence, and what appeared to him as a lack of structured civilization. Yet, as he spent more time observing them, his perspective began to shift. He noticed their fierce loyalties, their communal sharing of scarce resources, and their intense capacity for sympathy toward their own tribe members. He realized that beneath the vast cultural differences, they possessed the exact same bedrock of human emotions that he did. Darwin began to wonder how such noble traits, courage, self-sacrifice, and tribal loyalty could have evolved if nature only rewarded the fittest and the most selfish. The answer, which he intuited and which modern science has confirmed, is that these are morality genes forged in the crucible of kin selection and group survival. In the perilous ancestral environment, a tribe of individuals who only looked out for themselves would quickly be wiped out by predators, starvation, or rival groups. But a tribe composed of individuals who were instinctively loyal to their kin, who felt a deep sense of sympathy for their blood relatives, and who were willing to risk their lives to defend their shared genetic investment, would thrive and outcompete fractured groups. The moral sentiments we revere today, our capacity for empathy, our sense of duty, our outrage at injustice, did not begin as universal, abstract philosophical concepts. They originated as deeply biased, highly localized survival tools. We evolved to feel a profound sense of right and wrong precisely because those emotions bound our extended families together into cohesive, defensible units. The bounds of our family define the original bounds of our morality. We are wired to care deeply about the suffering of those inside our circle, and historically, we have been coldly indifferent to the suffering of those outside it. The grand challenge of human civilization has been taking these ancient tribal morality genes born from the selfish calculus of bloodlines and attempting to stretch them across a global society. Chapter 5. Friends and Darwin's Conscience. The evolutionary logic of bloodlines elegantly explains why a mother will defend her child or why brothers will fiercely protect one another. The mathematics of shared genes make kin selection a relatively straightforward biological transaction, but human society is not composed solely of genetic relatives. Everywhere we look, we see profound acts of cooperation, generosity, and genuine affection between individuals who share no discernible blood ties. People split the spoils of a hunt, defend their neighbors from attack, and build deep, enduring friendships that often rival the strength of familial bonds. If natural selection is fundamentally a brutal, self-interested competition for survival, how could it ever give rise to the quiet, beautiful phenomenon of friendship? To understand the biology of camaraderie, we must venture into the realm of game theory and reciprocal altruism. In the late 20th century, evolutionary biologists recognized that survival is not always a zero-sum game, where one creature's victory necessitates another's absolute defeat. Often, the harsh environments our ancestors navigated presented non-zero-sum challenges, scenarios where cooperation could yield a net positive outcome for everyone involved. Imagine two early hunters, each with fluctuating luck. On a given day, one might kill a large animal while the other catches nothing. If the successful hunter shares his surplus meat, which would likely spoil anyway, he incurs a very small cost. However, to the starving hunter, that meat represents immense, life-saving value. If the roles are reversed the following week and the favor is returned, both men have effectively purchased an insurance policy against starvation. This exchange is the engine of reciprocal altruism. For this system to evolve, an organism does not need to be an angel. It merely needs a sufficiently complex brain to remember past interactions. The math proves that a strategy of mutual backscratching will outcompete isolated selfishness over the long run, provided that the participants interact repeatedly and possess the cognitive ability to recognize one another. But this system contains a fatal vulnerability, the existence of cheaters. If an individual consistently accepts free meat but always refuses to share when their own luck turns, they will reap all the evolutionary benefits without paying any of the costs. A population of naive, unconditional sharers would quickly be decimated by a few ruthless parasites. Therefore, for reciprocal altruism to function, nature had to design an emotional immune system to detect, punish, and exclude those who do not play by the rules. This brings us to a profound realization. The cold, calculating mathematics of game theory are not experienced as spreadsheets in the human mind. We do not consciously calculate the genetic cost-benefit analysis of paying for a friend's dinner. Instead, we experience how tit-for-tat actually feels. The famous computer tournaments of the 1980s, which simulated the prisoner's dilemma, proved that the most robust winning strategy for survival was tit-for-tat, a program that begins by cooperating and then simply mimics its partner's last move, rewarding cooperation with cooperation and punishing betrayal with immediate retaliation. In the human psyche, the elegant logic of tit-for-tat has been translated by natural selection into our most cherished social emotions. What does it feel like to initiate a cooperative bond? It feels like fondness and liking. What does it feel like when someone repays our generosity? It feels like gratitude, a warm emotion that reinforces our desire to cooperate with them again. What does it feel like when someone violates the social contract and refuses to reciprocate? It feels like righteous anger, a fiery impulse designed to punish the cheater and signal to the rest of the tribe that we are not easily exploited. And what does it feel like when we ourselves are tempted to cheat, or when we recognize that we have shortchanged an ally? It feels like guilt. Guilt is natural selection's internal warning system, alerting us that our social bonds, which are utterly essential for our survival, are fraying and require immediate repair. Friendship, therefore, is not an escape from biology. It is a highly sophisticated, emotionally resonant accounting system managed by the unconscious mind. Skeptics of evolutionary psychology often bristle at this point. They ask if reducing love, friendship, and loyalty to biological algorithms is truly science, or merely a collection of cynical, just-so stories invented to explain away human virtue. But the framework of reciprocal altruism makes testable, verifiable predictions about human behavior. It predicts that our capacity for sympathy will be inherently sensitive to a person's past behavior. It predicts that we will feel the strongest urge to help those who have helped us, and that our outrage will be mathematically proportional to the severity of a social betrayal. Worldwide anthropological data consistently bears this out. Across every known culture, the concepts of fairness, reciprocity, and the punishment of free riders form the absolute bedrock of social life. Our deeply held beliefs about justice are not cultural artifacts. They are the inherited psychological architecture of a cooperative species. No historical figure provides a more fascinating lens through which to view these social emotions than Charles Darwin himself. By all contemporary accounts, Darwin possessed a conscience of almost agonizing sensitivity. He was relentlessly polite, agonizingly fair, and constantly consumed by the fear that he might have inadvertently offended someone or failed in his social obligations. If natural selection favors a degree of Machiavellian self-interest, how do we explain a man whose moral compass was so extreme that it frequently caused him physical distress? Darwin's conscience, viewed through the evolutionary lens, was not a divine spark of purity. It was a highly sensitive social navigation tool, calibrated to the intense scrutiny of Victorian society. In the ancestral environment, a human's reputation was their most valuable asset. Being labeled a cheat or a coward meant social exile, which was tantamount to a death sentence. To ensure survival, the human brain evolved a powerful mechanism to anticipate the judgment of the group and adjust behavior accordingly. Conscience is the internalized voice of the tribe. For a man of Darwin's social standing, embedded in a tight-knit network of scientists, clerics, and aristocrats, maintaining an impeccable reputation was paramount. His intense feelings of obligation and his crushing guilt over the smallest perceived slights were the mechanisms his biology used to safeguard his status. When Darwin spent years painstakingly cataloguing barnacles before publishing his grand theory, or when he bent over backward to acknowledge the contributions of his peers, he was being driven by an evolved psychological engine that demanded social harmony and feared ostracism. His profound decency was very real, but its origins lay not in a transcendent moral realm, but in the gritty ancestral imperative to be perceived as a valuable, trustworthy ally. We are designed by nature to be deeply moral creatures precisely because appearing moral is the most effective strategy for thriving in a profoundly social world. Chapter 6. Hierarchy, Status, and Social Strife. Charles Darwin made one of the most profound intellectual leaps in human history by his late 20s. By 1838, the core mechanism of natural selection, the blind, unguided process that shaped all living things, was crystal clear in his mind. He wrote a brief sketch of his theory in 1842, expanded it into a longer essay in 1844, and then, inexplicably, he locked it away in a drawer with a letter instructing his wife to publish it in the event of his sudden death. For 2 long decades, Darwin sat on the most explosive scientific idea of the century, dedicating his days instead to an exhaustively tedious 8-year study of barnacles. This prolonged hesitation, famously known as Darwin's delay, has long puzzled historians. Was he simply a meticulous perfectionist gathering more evidence? Was he paralyzed by physical illness? While these factors played a role, evolutionary psychology points to a much deeper, more primal cause. Darwin was terrified of losing his social status. In the Victorian era, proposing that humans were merely modified apes was not just a scientific controversy, it was profound social heresy. It threatened the foundational religious and political structures of his society. Darwin knew that publishing his theory would invite the wrath of the church, the scorn of his scientific peers, and the horror of his respectable aristocratic friends. For a man whose psychological machinery was exquisitely tuned to the approval of his tribe, this prospect was biologically terrifying. To understand the agonizing physical symptoms Darwin endured, the palpitations, the nausea, the crippling anxiety, we must understand the immense evolutionary weight of social status. For our hunter-gatherer ancestors, social status was not a luxury. It was a matter of life and death. In the relentless calculus of natural selection, individuals at the top of the tribal hierarchy enjoyed the best access to food, the safest sleeping locations, and, most importantly, the greatest choice of reproductive mates. Those at the bottom of the ladder faced starvation during lean times and were frequently excluded from the genetic lottery altogether. Because the stakes were absolute, evolution hardwired the human brain to be obsessively attuned to its exact position within the social hierarchy. We are deeply, continuously, and largely unconsciously calculating our relative standing in every room we enter. This ancient obsession is managed by a sophisticated neurochemical control system with serotonin playing a starring role. Modern science often simplifies serotonin as a happy chemical, but in the context of evolutionary biology, it is more accurately described as a status chemical. Studies of primates have revealed a fascinating biochemical feedback loop. When a male monkey ascends the social hierarchy and achieves dominance, his brain floods with serotonin, making him calm, confident, and socially assertive. If he is overthrown, his serotonin levels plummet, leading to behaviors that resemble deep clinical depression. He becomes withdrawn, submissive, and anxious. This biochemical mechanism is perfectly preserved in human beings. Our self-esteem is essentially an internal, biological readout of our perceived social status. When we achieve success, receive praise, or dominate a rival, our serotonin rises and we feel a surge of confidence that encourages us to pursue further social gains. Conversely, when we suffer a humiliating defeat, lose our job, or are rejected by our peers, our serotonin drops. The resulting feelings of depression and worthlessness, while painful, serve a grim evolutionary purpose. They force us to retreat, submit, and avoid further, potentially fatal, conflicts with superior rivals until we can safely reassess our position. While the drive for status is universal, the strategies for achieving it diverge significantly between men and women, reflecting their different reproductive constraints. Because male reproductive success in the ancestral environment was virtually limitless for those at the top, male hierarchies tend to be fiercely competitive, rigid, and intensely focused on public dominance. Men are biologically prone to taking high-stakes risks to secure the alpha position because historically the genetic payoff was astronomical. Female hierarchies, by contrast, tend to be less about physical dominance and more about subtle, complex webs of alliance and exclusion. Because a woman's reproductive ceiling is relatively low regardless of her status, she gains less from risking her life in physical combat, but she gains immensely from securing stable, protective networks for her offspring. If we want to understand the raw, unvarnished reality of our own hierarchical instincts, we need only look at our closest genetic relatives. What is it like to be a chimp? Primatologists like Frans de Waal have documented the astonishing political lives of chimpanzees, revealing societies driven by relentless ambition, strategic grooming, and shifting alliances. A chimpanzee alpha male does not rule by brute strength alone, he rules by coalition. He must constantly groom his supporters, share resources, and expertly divide his enemies. The moment he shows weakness, his former allies will swiftly conspire to tear him down. When we observe the corporate boardroom, the political campaign, or the high school cafeteria, we are witnessing the exact same primate politics, merely dressed in different clothing and mediated by language. This inescapable reality of hierarchy raises profound and troubling questions about the nature of morality. If human society is inherently structured around dominance and submission, how do we explain our lofty ideals of justice and equality? The grim truth of evolutionary psychology is that our moral frameworks are frequently designed to justify the existing hierarchy, a phenomenon where might slowly masquerades as right. Those in power naturally promote moral codes that legitimize their dominance, while those at the bottom advocate for fairness and redistribution only as a strategy to improve their own standing. We invoke high-minded moral principles when it serves our social interests, and we conveniently forget them when they threaten our position. Are there exceptions to this rule? Anthropologists have searched the globe for truly egalitarian societies, often pointing to indigenous groups like the Zuni of North America as proof that human beings can live without status anxiety. The Zuni culture actively discouraged self-promotion. Individuals who boasted or sought leadership were viewed with intense suspicion. For a time, it seemed they had conquered the Darwinian drive for dominance, but deeper observation revealed that the status hierarchy had not been eradicated. It had simply been driven underground. In Zuni society, the ultimate status symbol was appearing not to want status. The most respected, powerful individuals were those who most perfectly performed the role of humble, self-effacing community members. The currency of dominance had changed, but the deep biological competition remained completely intact. Darwin understood this primate theater better than anyone. His crippling delay in publishing his theory was not an act of cowardice. It was an act of profound, biologically mandated caution. He was a high-status male in a rigid Victorian hierarchy, and his brain was screaming at him to protect his position. He only found the courage to publish when he received a letter from a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, who had independently stumbled upon the exact same theory of natural selection. Faced with the sudden, terrifying prospect of losing the ultimate scientific priority, the highest possible intellectual status, Darwin's competitive instincts finally overrode his social anxieties. The hierarchy that had terrified him into silence for 20 years was the exact same force that finally pushed him to change the world. Chapter 7. Deception and Self-Deception. In the relentless, high-stakes theater of human evolution, the ability to accurately read the intentions of others is a fundamental survival skill. Our ancestors had to constantly evaluate who was a reliable ally, who was a potential threat, and who was secretly harboring intentions to cheat the social contract. To navigate this complex web of reciprocal altruism and tribal hierarchy, the human brain evolved into a sophisticated lie-detecting machine. We became hypersensitive to the subtle cues of dishonesty, the averted gaze, the nervous shifting of weight, the slight hesitation in speech, and the involuntary micro-expressions that betray hidden motives. But evolution is never a static process. It is a perpetual arms race. As our capacity to detect deception grew more refined, natural selection simultaneously favored individuals who could bypass those very alarms. The pressure was on to become better, more convincing liars. The fundamental problem with lying is that it is cognitively exhausting and physiologically risky. When we consciously tell a falsehood, our brain has to simultaneously hold the truth, construct the fabrication, and monitor our body language to ensure we do not give the game away. This immense cognitive load often results in the very physiological leaks, sweating, stuttering, or flushing that our peers have evolved to detect. How then could natural selection engineer a more flawless deceiver? The evolutionary biologist Robert Wright proposed a radically elegant and deeply unsettling answer. The most effective way to deceive others is to first deceive yourself. If your conscious mind genuinely believes the lie you are projecting, there is no cognitive dissonance. There are no physiological leaks to suppress because as far as your conscious awareness is concerned, you are telling the absolute truth. Natural selection, therefore, began to partition the human brain. It created an architecture where the unconscious mind handles the brutal, self-serving Darwinian calculations of status, mating, and survival, while deliberately hiding these nakedly selfish motives from the conscious mind. We are biologically wired to believe our own propaganda. This inner blindness manifests most clearly in our social interactions, leading to a phenomenon of deeply dubious accounting. When we navigate friendships, rivalries, and professional relationships, we like to think of ourselves as impartial judges, weighing the facts of our interactions with objective fairness. In reality, the human brain acts much more like a highly paid defense attorney tasked solely with building an impenetrable case for its client's righteousness. We possess a selectively porous memory. When we do a favor for a friend, our brain meticulously records the expenditure of our time and resources, ensuring we hold on to the social debt. But when a friend does a favor for us, the memory tends to fade much more quickly, minimizing our sense of obligation. This asymmetry extends violently into the realm of grievances. We remember the slights, insults, and betrayals inflicted upon us with agonizing, high-definition clarity. Yet, we display an astonishing capacity to forget, rationalize, or completely minimize the harm we inflict upon others. If we behave selfishly, our brain instantly supplies a barrage of extenuating circumstances. We were tired, we were under immense pressure, or the other person provoked us. If someone else behaves identically, we attribute their actions to deep-seated character flaws. This is not accidental hypocrisy. It is a meticulously evolved survival mechanism. By constantly convincing ourselves that we are aggrieved, righteous, and inherently moral, we become incredibly effective advocates for our own genetic interests. We can forcefully demand a larger share of resources or status without the debilitating hesitation of guilt because we genuinely believe we deserve it. The human mind evolved to construct a flattering, deeply sanitized narrative of our own lives, and then to fiercely protect that narrative from the intrusion of inconvenient truths. To see the absolute pinnacle of this psychological architecture in action, we need only look at the crowning moment of Charles Darwin's life. For 20 years, Darwin had painstakingly hoarded his explosive theory of natural selection, driven by a paralyzing fear of social ruin. But in the early summer of 1858, the protective walls he had built around his secret were spectacularly breached. He received a manuscript in the mail from Alfred Russel Wallace, a brilliant, impoverished naturalist working in the Malay archipelago. As Darwin read the pages, his blood ran cold. Wallace had independently discovered the exact mechanism of natural selection. In a matter of pages, Wallace had articulated the very theory Darwin had spent 2 decades agonizing over. Darwin was plunged into a state of profound moral and psychological crisis. As a Victorian gentleman, his conscious mind was completely tethered to the ideals of honor, fairness, and disinterested scientific inquiry. He wrote frantic letters to his closest confidants, the eminent geologist Charles Lyell and the botanist Joseph Hooker, expressing his absolute despair. In these letters, Darwin's self-deception operates with magnificent, tragic beauty. He repeatedly insists that he would rather burn his entire book than seem to have behaved in a paltry or selfish spirit. He claims he does not care about priority, that Wallace must be given full credit, and that his own life's work is now essentially worthless. His conscious mind genuinely believed it was stepping aside with noble grace. But beneath this performance of aristocratic humility, Darwin's unconscious survival mechanisms were screaming for intervention. By sending the letters detailing his agony to Lyell and Hooker, Darwin was effectively deploying his high-status allies to do the dirty work his conscience would not permit him to do himself. Lyell and Hooker, recognizing the immense value of their friend's life's work, immediately orchestrated a brilliant, if ethically questionable, scientific coup. They arranged for a joint reading of both Darwin's and Wallace's papers at the next meeting of the Linnean Society. Crucially, they ensured that Darwin's unpublished sketches, dating back to 1844, were read first, firmly establishing his chronological priority. Wallace, thousands of miles away in the jungle, was not consulted about this arrangement until it was entirely a done deal. Darwin's triumph was absolute. When he finally published On the Origin of Species the following year, it shook the foundations of the world, securing his legacy as one of the greatest scientific minds in human history. Yet he achieved this victory while perfectly preserving his self-image as a humble, uncompetitive gentleman who had almost surrendered his crown to a rival out of sheer decency. He never had to face the naked reality of his own ruthless ambition. The deep irony is that the very psychological mechanisms Darwin used to navigate this crisis, the strategic alliances, the subtle signaling of distress, the exquisite self-deception masking intense evolutionary competition, are exactly the phenomena his revolutionary theory would eventually explain. His triumph was not just a victory for the theory of natural selection, it was a flawless, living demonstration of the moral animal in action. Chapter 8. Evolutionary Ethics and Modern Cynicism. For the better part of the 20th century, when humanity sought to understand the dark, submerged contours of its own psyche, it turned primarily to one man, Sigmund Freud. Freud's immense cultural influence rested on a profound and unsettling insight, that the conscious mind is not the master of its own house. He correctly diagnosed that we are driven by powerful hidden urges, and that our polished, civilized behavior is often merely a fragile crust covering a chaotic cauldron of animalistic desires. He gave us the vocabulary of the unconscious, teaching us to look for the hidden motives behind our slips of the tongue, our dreams, and our neuroses. Yet for all his literary brilliance, Freud's architecture of the mind was biologically arbitrary. The mechanisms he proposed, the Oedipus complex, the intricate psychosexual stages of development, the ongoing civil war between the id, ego, and superego, were essentially magnificent guesswork. They lacked a grounding in the rigorous, brutal logic of natural selection. Evolutionary psychology does not discard the concept of a dark unconscious, rather it replaces Freud's chaotic, shadowy basement with a highly organized, flawlessly engineered corporate boardroom. The Darwinian unconscious is far more logical and perhaps far more cynical than anything Freud ever imagined. It is not a repository of repressed desires to murder our fathers and marry our mothers. Instead, it is a meticulous, calculating machine designed with a single, overriding objective, the proliferation of genetic material. Our hidden motives are not random or inherently destructive. They are profoundly strategic. When we unconsciously sabotage a rival, stretch the truth to impress a mate, or instinctively favor our siblings over strangers, we are executing complex algorithms written by millions of years of evolutionary trial and error. This revelation operates as a universal solvent, threatening to dissolve the comforting narratives of modern intellectual life. In recent decades, the academic world has been heavily influenced by the postmodern mind, a philosophical framework that views all claims to objective truth with intense suspicion. Postmodernism argues that our societal narratives, our moral frameworks, and our institutions are merely social constructs designed to mask raw power struggles. In a fascinating twist, evolutionary psychology agrees with the postmodernists that human interactions are fundamentally power struggles driven by hidden agendas. It agrees that human beings are masterful manipulators who use moral language to cloak their own self-interest. But where postmodernism sees arbitrary cultural programming, Darwinism sees universal biological design. Evolutionary psychology drives a final nail into the coffin of the blank slate theories of human nature. The doomed rivals of the Darwinian paradigm, radical behaviorism and pure cultural determinism, failed because they refused to acknowledge that the human mind comes preloaded with an ancient, highly specific software. We are not simply molded by our cultures. Our cultures are the emergent products of our shared, evolved human nature. This realization leads us into deeply uncomfortable territory. If we peel back the layers of human behavior and find that our most cherished virtues, our capacity for love, our fierce loyalties, our outrage at injustice, are fundamentally rooted in a self-serving genetic calculus, what happens to morality? If a mother's devotion is simply a mechanism for gene survival, and if our friendships are essentially subconscious accounting systems of reciprocal favors, the world can suddenly appear unbearably cynical. It can feel as though the warmth has been drained from the human experience, leaving only the cold mathematics of biological replication. This philosophical precipice forces us to confront the naturalistic fallacy, the disastrous assumption that what is natural is what ought to be. For over a century, thinkers have repeatedly stumbled into this trap, looking to the natural world for moral guidance. If nature rewards the strong and eliminates the weak, the flawed logic goes, then society should do the same. This dark reasoning birthed the horrors of social Darwinism and various eugenic movements, twisting biology into a justification for cruelty, inequality, and oppression. The modern Darwinian paradigm demands that we violently reject the naturalistic fallacy. Nature is not a benevolent creator. It is a blind, staggering, and staggeringly cruel process. Natural selection is driven by immense suffering, ruthless exploitation, and an unfathomable ocean of death. To look to the mechanism of evolution for moral instruction is an act of profound intellectual bankruptcy. Our genes care nothing for our happiness, our spiritual fulfillment, or our ethical consistency. They care only about their own transmission. They have programmed us to be aggressively nepotistic, obsessed with status, and breathtakingly hypocritical. How then do we build a valid system of evolutionary ethics? If our internal moral compass is hopelessly rigged by our biology, how can we ever claim to be truly good? The answer lies in recognizing the profound difference between the origin of an impulse and its ultimate utility. Evolution may have given us a brain designed for selfish genetic proliferation, but in doing so, it inadvertently gave us the most powerful tool in the known universe, the capacity for conscious, rational reflection. We are the first species in the history of life on Earth capable of understanding the invisible forces that designed us. And because we can understand them, we possess the unprecedented ability to rebel against them. To construct a genuinely moral life, we must engage in a deliberate, exhausting mutiny against our own biology. We must recognize that our instinctive sense of justice is frequently just a disguised demand for our own advantage or the advantage of our kin. When we feel the powerful, righteous urge for retribution, the deep, satisfying desire to see a wrongdoer suffer, we must realize that this is not a divine moral truth. It is simply a biological mechanism designed to prevent us from being exploited in the ancestral environment. A viable post-Darwinian ethic finds a strong foundation in the philosophy of utilitarianism, championed by thinkers like John Stuart Mill. True utilitarianism seeks to maximize the overall happiness and minimize the overall suffering of all conscious beings, regardless of their genetic relationship to us. This is a profoundly unnatural concept. Our biology screams at us to value the life of our child infinitely more than the lives of 100 strangers. It urges us to hoard resources, to climb the hierarchy, and to crush our rivals. To be truly moral, therefore, is to fight an uphill battle against the very essence of our design. It is to take the exquisite emotional tools that evolution granted us, sympathy, empathy, and love, and willfully stretch them beyond their intended biological boundaries. It requires the immense cognitive effort of extending our compassion not just to our kin and not just to our reciprocal allies, but to the stranger, the outcast, and even the enemy. The ultimate ethical triumph of the human animal is not found in acting out our nature, but in successfully, consciously transcending it. Chapter 9. Blaming the Victim. The entire architecture of human society, from our informal moral judgments to the imposing marble-clad institutions of our legal system, rests upon a single foundational assumption: the existence of free will. We believe that human beings are the conscious authors of their own actions. We operate on the premise that when a person commits a crime, betrays a friend, or performs an act of extraordinary cruelty, they did so out of a sovereign, independent choice. They could have chosen otherwise, but they did not, and therefore they are morally culpable. They deserve the blame, and they deserve the punishment. But when the uncompromising lens of evolutionary psychology is turned upon the machinery of the human mind, this comforting theatre of free will begins to violently collapse. If our deep psychological desires, our status anxieties, our mating strategies, and our capacities for both immense love and brutal violence are all the legacy of a blind, algorithmic process of genetic replication, where precisely does the conscious self step in to take the steering wheel? Evolutionary biology suggests a deeply unsettling form of determinism. Every human action is the unavoidable output of a complex equation, the specific genetic code inherited from our ancestors, multiplied by the specific environmental circumstances we encounter from the moment of conception onward. The brain is a physical system, governed entirely by the laws of biochemistry and physics. To suggest that there is a ghost in the machine, a pure, uncaused will that operates independently of our biology and our environment, is to step outside the realm of science and into the realm of mysticism. This deterministic reality forces a profoundly uncomfortable reckoning with how we view the perpetrators of society's most egregious harms. Consider the devastating reality of violent crime, which is overwhelmingly committed by young men operating in environments of intense poverty and social deprivation. If we abandon the myth of free will, we must look at these individuals not as uniquely evil souls, but as biological organisms executing a highly predictable, historically successful evolutionary strategy. For a young male in a stable, affluent environment, the biological imperative to secure status and attract mates is best served by a slow strategy: studying hard, obeying the law, delaying gratification, and building a long-term reputation. But for a young male born into an environment where resources are scarce, mortality rates are high, and the traditional avenues to social dominance are completely blocked, the organism's internal calculus violently shifts. The brain interprets the environment as dangerously unstable and triggers a fast, reproductive strategy. In a world where long-term survival is doubtful, the evolutionary mandate is to acquire immediate high-stakes status through aggression, risk-taking, and dominance displays. The violence that terrifies civilized society is often not a malfunction of the human animal. It is the tragic, terrifyingly rational execution of an ancient survival program deployed in a modern, toxic environment. In this strictly biological sense, the perpetrator is also a victim. They are a captive of their own genetic inheritance and the specific environmental triggers that activated their most destructive potentials. But when we hear this, a powerful, almost physical revulsion rises within us. Our blood boils at the idea of absolving murderers, thieves, and abusers of their moral responsibility. We feel a desperate, burning urge to see the wicked suffer for their transgressions. We must recognize that this very outrage, the visceral hunger for retribution, is itself a biological adaptation. The urge to punish is not a transcendent moral truth handed down from the cosmos. It is an evolutionary technology. In our ancestral hunter-gatherer bands, an individual who did not possess a fierce, unyielding instinct to punish cheaters and wrongdoers would quickly be exploited and driven to genetic extinction. We evolved to experience the desire for revenge as a profound, righteous mandate, because treating it as a sacred duty was the most effective way to deter the exploitation of our tribe. Our biology cons us into believing in objective, cosmic justice, because believing in it makes us terrifyingly effective enforcers of our own boundaries. Darwin's diagnosis of this philosophical nightmare was remarkably prescient. Long before the discovery of DNA or neurochemistry, Darwin peered into the abyss of determinism and saw the inescapable truth. In his private notebooks, written while he was formulating the theory of natural selection, he reasoned that if humans were essentially animals modified by descent, then they were ultimately biological machines. He explicitly rejected the concept of free will. He noted that every action, every thought, and every base desire was the result of a long, unbroken chain of physical causes. For Darwin, this realization did not lead to a dark, nihilistic despair. Instead, it blossomed into a radical, almost agonizing compassion. If no one is truly the ultimate author of their own actions, he reasoned, then no one truly deserves cosmic blame for their failures, nor do they deserve arrogant praise for their triumphs. The criminal, the coward, and the cheat are no more guilty of their defective nature than a person is guilty of being born with a physical deformity. In his private writings, Darwin urged himself to look upon the wickedness of others with the same clinical, empathetic detachment a physician might have for a terrible disease. One must pity the criminal, he believed, for they are the unfortunate vessels of a tragic biological destiny. Yet this profound deterministic empathy creates an immediate practical crisis. If no one is morally to blame, do we empty the prisons? Do we tear down the justice system and allow violent evolutionary algorithms to run rampant through our cities? The answer is a resolute no, but the justification for the system must permanently change. Once we discard the illusion of free will, we must also discard the concept of retributive justice, the idea that we punish people simply because they deserve to suffer. A civilized, post-Darwinian justice system must become entirely utilitarian. We cannot punish out of vengeance. We must punish solely for deterrence and quarantine. If a machine is broken and poses a lethal threat to the public, we do not lock it away because we are angry at it, nor do we inflict pain upon it because it deserves to suffer. We quarantine the machine to protect the innocent, and we attempt to reprogram it if possible. The criminal justice system of the future must operate on this exact sterile logic. The threat of prison remains an absolute necessity, because the human brain is exquisitely designed to calculate risk, and the certainty of harsh consequences is one of the few environmental inputs powerful enough to override the biological impulse for violent, short-term status-seeking. By understanding the true, mechanical nature of the moral animal, we are forced to walk a philosophical tightrope. We must maintain a society strict enough to deter the darkest, most destructive impulses of our evolutionary programming, while simultaneously harboring a deep, quiet realization that the people we are forced to condemn are fundamentally victims of a universe they did not choose. We must dispense punishment not with righteous fury, but with a profound, tragic sorrow.